Welcome back to the third edition of the Finance Summit, Finance in Common Summit. Nous poursuivons cette journée du sommet Finance en commun, édition 3, une journée ponctuée, on l'a vu, de panels.
We had a day of panels and very high-level speeches. Let me mention it, and this is a first. Since it is the first time it is being held in Africa, as indicated by President Adesina, and as indicated by the Prime Minister Patrick Haché, that should change things. Now, our high level number 4, accelerating climate change adaptation through PDB collaborations.
This Climate Policy Initiative. Nicole, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'd like to take a moment to introduce my panel. We have Dr. Mahmoud Mohleddin, the COP27 High-Level Climate Action Champion, joining us online. We have Mr. Ambroise Fayol, Vice President of the European Investment Bank. Dr. Amal Lee Amin, Managing Director of the British International Investment and the Adaptation and Resilience Investors Collaborative, also joining us online. Mr. Kevin Juma, African Forest Carbon Catalyst Director of the Nature Conservancy. And Mrs. Rejoice Amarachi Yusim from Simke Foods Limited, Nigeria, and winner of the Africa Adaptation Acceleration Program's Youth Adapt Challenge. Welcome, everyone. So after the discussions that we've heard earlier today, I think we can all agree that finance for adaptation and resilience is still far below the amount needed. While adaptation finance has increased over the last 5 years, reaching $46 billion in 2020 and $49 billion in 2021, the UNEP estimates that the annual adaptation costs in developing economies will be in the range of 155 to 330 billion annually by 2030. And although the public sector continues to provide almost all of the adaptation financing, in 2020 it represented only 14% of the total climate finance by the public sector. In CPI's recent analysis tracking public sector commitments, we also found that only 6 of the 70 largest public financial institutions in the Finance in Common database explicitly mentioned adaptation in their climate strategies. So before we turn it over to our panelists, I wanted to take a quick audience poll. So raise your hand if yes. Is adaptation a priority for your organization? All right, I see just a handful of hands. So as a follow-up, would you like to see adaptation be more of a priority to your organization? All right, seeing more hands there. Thank you for your participation. And now we're going to turn it over to our panel of experts who will be discussing concrete ways for public development banks and other financial actors to accelerate investment in adaptation. Dr. Mohleddin, thank you for joining us online. Given Egypt's role in presiding over COP27, what are your expectations from public development banks when it comes to adaptation finance, particularly in the most vulnerable countries?
Right, thank you so much. I'm missing the opportunity to be with you in person, but I followed that it was a success in the meetings and engagements and the approach. So congratulations for all of the organizers, and missing Cote d'Ivoire, great deal from where I am now, just landed from Geneva to Cairo in preparation of the COP. So all in a good cause, for the same good cause on the climate finance and the climate agenda. So before finance, I was very much engaged during the last few weeks on important discussion that gets us into trade-offs and synergies. And perhaps before we ask finance from the major development financing institutions, including the public development banks and the MDBs, there is something that they do that is worth more than money, perhaps, is knowledge sharing and public awareness. And when it comes to adaptation, we are really in trouble because not just because of the funds are less and there is a lot of funding gaps to be fulfilled, but it seems to me that issues of adaptation have been taken for granted, that they are the responsibility of domestic, local, and national governments. And there is very little role to be played by major international institutions, with few exceptions. And there is a theory actually behind that mitigation can do all what we can, which failed actually as a theory because we didn't do critically good in that front. So we need more adaptation. If we finish our homework in mitigation, we wouldn't be discussing adaptation as such today. But something even more controversial, people would tell you that reducing emissions somewhere in Europe or in Africa will have an impact on Asia or the United States, because we all live in this a global climate that is going to be impacted positively or negatively by actions or no actions, by good things or bad things. We do that. So reducing emissions is being praised as a good thing, and tracing emissions is great as well. That's definitely the case, and the IPCC report is telling us that we need to do more of what we're doing. Otherwise, we'll be drifting even more from the targets of 2030. Instead of reducing emissions by 45%, we know that we're adding to the emissions by 15% roughly, so are deviating from target by 60%. But the adaptation, the interesting matter here, they tell you that adaptation is a very localized effort. So if you fix your agricultural system or your water management, or you do better in your coastal fronts, that may not really have a global impact, or it's not a part of the global public good. It's a domestic public good. This is a big mistake. I'm not going to take it from the moral responsibilities of emitters since first industrial revolution. This is a very good political argument, and it has its own merits as well if we can translate it into economic and financial flows. But actually, as what we see, if you are making societies and economies more vulnerable, that will compromise positions elsewhere. Through many channels. One of them is through forced migration or climate refugees, which started to be a phenomenon in some cases. Second, even out of adhering to self-interest rule, even if, God forbid, we don't care about what happens to others, which is bad enough, but even if we just care about ourselves and our neighborhood, especially with the rise of some populist movements in some particular places, out of self-interest, you need to invest in this area, because again, this issue of migration will be on the rise, forced migration, not the kind of migration that we like to see as part of labor mobility. The other thing, even if in self-interest, you need to have stable markets for expanding your role, if you believe in capitalism still, and the impact on international trade, investments, and all of that. And then what we have seen as well, which is the rule of the game, if we don't spend sufficiently well in the prevention, we'll be required to be spending more in dealing with the cures of what we failed in preventing. So this is just an important argument, which is basically the political economy background of the need to take adaptation more seriously. But for that to happen, we need three things, based on a discussion that we had as well with Professor Duflo, organized by the World Bank during the annual meetings. And I had the pleasure of interviewing her or commenting on her excellent points. There is no divorce between development finance and climate finance. Let's resolve this issue. MDBs, development finance institutions, and it's great that we see the leaders in the finance in common, the leaders on EIB, African Development Bank, had that in their mandate. We see no contradiction or trade-offs between the two. It's all about synergies. The second thing, that we need really to have finance coupled with technology and technical assistance and knowledge sharing. And this is the beauty of the finance that comes from the MDBs and the public development institutions, because they don't just give you dollars or euros, but they provide as well technical assistance. And the final thing, it's about behavioral change. And here, I'm not going to be asking the MDBs for more than money, knowledge, and technical assistance, but behavioral change through standards, enhancing better regulations. Now there are people talking about what we can do, even in designing our tax policies and fiscal policies in order to provide incentives. If you put all of that, before we talk about the gaps, which are known, I quote from the Climate Policy Initiative, the global one, and in Africa, there are more needed, at least in the case of Africa, 6 times of what we have been seeing. So far, 11.4 billion that have been traced, of which 97% is coming from the public sources and 3% from the private sources. Actually, the 3%, to my own surprise, in the case of Africa, is more than the 2% of private sector participation in adaptation globally. So I was happily surprised. I said, well, fantastic. Let's see how the private sector then today is doing 3%. Next year, it could be more. In a couple of years, it could be 10%. There is an issue here. When you do some sort of more granular analysis with more details, you will see that the private sector here is more of foundations, philanthropies. So they are basically non-public but non-private at the same time, many of them. So you may end up with less than 1% of private sector participation in adaptation. So one area here is basically trying to find the model in which the private sector can find itself, as we see it in mitigation, in projects in solar, in wind farms, in decarbonization, in green hydrogen, and the likes. And we can really see that happening through many things in design of programs, including the Nexus approach, get food with water, with energy. Through Nexus approach, that could be a good way of doing it, or perhaps through more de-risking, more incentives. But definitely we need better partnership model than the one that we have today. Otherwise, we'll be still relying on public finance, and not just external finance that's doing the heavy lifting. Let me remind you that even in the lowest of income of countries in Africa and other developing economies, the entities that are doing the heavy lifting in adaptation still is the budget of the state. Directly is through domestic resource mobilization, or indirectly through borrowing abroad in order to finance the adaptation effort. So I hope that in COP27, all of these issues, specifically in areas related to agriculture, food systems, water management, are going to be tackled. And I'm happy to tell you, and I'm sorry I took more time than what I intended. I finished yesterday the 5th round that we started with the 5 regional economic commissions of the UN. So we now have pipeline of projects, investable projects. I shared the approach with my good friend Ambroise and with Remy Rio as well. And I'm happy to tell them and all of the audience and participants interested that we have a pipeline of projects in the 5 economic regions, including Africa, and they are ready for your consideration. And we're going to be sharing 50 of them, 10 by each economic region during Sharm. But the full list with details is going to be available, and more details on request from the region economic commissions of the UN and from the champions as well. This was an initiative by COP27. Over to you.
Thank you so much. Moving on, Mr. Friot, how are MDBs addressing calls for action on adaptation that Dr. Mohleddin has just outlined, and what is the EIB doing in particular?
Well, thank you very much. Thanks a lot for the invitation. Hello to Mahmoud. Actually, I'm going to go in the direction that Mahmoud has already explained. I would say quickly, 3 things for MDBs, 3 things for EIB. For MDBs, it is clear, and you see that adaptation is becoming a bigger issue by the year, I would say. And that everybody in all geographies see now that what is happening already in Africa for some time, which is adaptation, is already there, because you have to deal with the the consequences of the change of the climate change that is already hurting the economy and the country, is something that you see now in all geographies, and they all have to include an adaptation part of their project. The second thing is when you look at the figures, we have published last week what we call the MDB Finance Climate report. That is a report that gives all figures on the action by MDBs for climate, be it high income, low income, of course with a focus on low and middle income, be it mitigation or adaptation. And the two figures that I would like to give you is the figure for adaptation was 19 billion euros by MDBs in 2021. This is something that is a figure that is in big increase compared with the previous year. And it is 19 billion out of 82 billion for total climate finance reported by the multilateral development banks. So you could say, okay, 19 out of 82 is not that significant. Actually, the figure that I find interesting is that while out of the 82, about 60 to 65% were in low-income countries. For the adaptation part, it is 95% in low-income countries. So we try as MDBs really to have a focus on adaptation even more on low-income countries because it is probably also more needed in some geographies. And the third thing on MDBs is that we work a lot actually as a group of multilateral development banks on adaptation, and we will make an announcement we will make an announcement in COP27, and this is in various things, but in particular, there will be, and there has been a lot of work on trying to harmonize methodologies that we use in NDBs to track adaptation finance. And there has been already something announced a few years ago. We are now making progress in the methodology to include not only infrastructure projects, but also other kind of projects. Now for EIB, quickly, three things on what we do. We have, our DNA is not really adaptation. Our DNA is really being very big in mitigation. But we see that we need to include much more now adaptation parts in the projects we finance. And we have pure adaptation projects also now. We have committed in Glasgow at COP26 to triple by 25 the amount of projects that the part of adaptation in our climate projects. So it was 5% of climate projects. It's going to be at least 15% by 25. So as I said, this starts from a low level, but to triple it means that we need really to pay much more attention, and that's going to be monitored closely at the bank. The second thing is we've decided to try to work on the issue of climate data. And what we have decided with the Copernicus Climate Change Services, with whom we have an agreement, is to share with our clients the much improved data that are going to be useful for them in the implementation of the projects, and that's also something that is adaptation. And finally, but I'm not going to develop because there is a beneficiary of this on this panel. We are a partner, as Mahmoud said, of what we call the AAAP, so the African Adaptation Acceleration Program, that has been put in place by the African Development Bank in most vulnerable countries in partnership with the Global Center on Adaptation.
Thank you very much, and I think I speak for many of the research institutes here when I say we're excited about your data progress rolling out. Dr. Amali Amin, as the last representative of a public financial institution on our panel, I'm hoping I can get your perspective on the priorities that have been outlined so far. Where do you see public development banks making the biggest contribution? And what is BII looking to do to help?
Great, thank you very much. And I'm sorry I can't be there with you in person, but it's great to be at this third Financing Common event. Where we were very active in leading a session on adaptation and particularly how to accelerate private sector investment into adaptation when we were at the first Financing Common Summit hosted in Paris in November 2020. So just to explain it, first of all, as British International Investment, we are the UK's DFI and an impact investor. So we only invest in private sector companies via directly or via funds or financial intermediaries. And we provide patient, flexible capital to really help grow the private sector in Africa and Asia primarily, and look to invest to create impact to boost productivity, sustainability, particularly climate financed investments, as well as inclusive investments, particularly for low-income countries and communities, as well as in gender, more diversity in our investments as well. So just, I think that's important context when talking about this particular topic around adaptation resilience, because we know now that there is an incredibly urgent challenge to step up the solutions needed to help build resilience and help countries and communities and sectors adapt to the already existing climate impacts. I mean, we only have to look this year at devastating impacts in Africa, currently with droughts, very severe drought in East Africa, devastating floods in Pakistan recently. I mean, we know there is a huge and urgent need for this agenda. I think also just in responding to some of the points that were made, as Mahmoud said, the assumption has been for many years, I would say, that the focus should be entirely around the role of governments to focus on adaptation, and much less really on the need to really unlock private investment. And and I think where we are now, we have there are a number of barriers to private investment, and it's essential we remove these, because we know the private sector is actually much better at managing risk, and so can really not can but must play a key role in enabling countries to manage the physical climate risk already being faced. And to really help unlock the private sector, a number of barriers will need to be addressed. And that really does require what I would refer to as deep or even radical collaboration. And this is something that we launched at the Financing Commons Summit in Paris in November 2020 with a number of other DFIs, as well as development banks. I'm delighted that European Investment Bank are a member of the collaborative, as well as the Islamic Development Bank. And the collaborative is for accelerating investment for climate resilient accelerating resilient investment collaborative to deliver on this. So ARIC, and this initiative we've been working on over the last 2 years to really identify how we can better collaborate and how we can bring different resources together to really unlock the investment that is needed. And some of that, again, going back to the points that was made earlier, I think it's essential that we bring knowledge and expertise to the challenge as well, whether that's for governments, but also other key stakeholders, including the private sector. So we, as British International Investment, we're actually looking to invest more in the solutions that are going to be necessary to bring resiliency and adaptation. Many of these are very early stage, so more in the sort of venture capital type space, either directly or via funds. We've been working with our funds. We had an event actually in Cairo just last month where we brought together all of our funds in our portfolio, as well as some of the portfolio companies, to really start to help them understand better the challenges, as well as what the opportunities may be for them as funds to actually invest more in those companies, these particularly early stage companies that can bring those adaptation resiliency services. And so, this was a really important step, helping build their own capabilities so that they then can go and invest more in their relevant markets. And, we are seeing some really, really interesting opportunities. As I said, quite early stage and often quite small scale, but the impact can be huge. So I do think, when we think about adaptation resilience, it's important not to assume that we shouldn't only measure success by the amount of finance being mobilized. I mean, of course, that is essential. We all know that it has to be scaled up, and the commitments that have been made need to be delivered. But we need to recognize that actually, particularly for adaptation finance, the impact of these solutions can be really significant compared to actually what the type of investment, scale of investment might otherwise imply. So it's quite different, I think, to the mitigation agenda in that respect. I do want to highlight also the importance of concessional funding. I think, as was already mentioned, we have a new climate innovation facility where we've been, in fact, even just before COP26, we made our first investment in a company based in Kenya, Pula, that is looking to provide pay at harvest insurance for smallholder farmers linked to climate parametric models. So helping to ensure that the smallholder farmers can actually be covered in the event of a particularly bad year due to climate change. And this does require patient and risk-tolerant capital to really help grow these very innovative and early-stage businesses. So we do need to bring those resources to the table. I think has been mentioned. I'd love to say a bit more about the collaborative and what we're doing, but maybe come back at a later stage on that.
Thank you so much. There'll be a follow-up question where you can elaborate a little bit more as well. So we've definitely heard from the financial institutions and Dr. Mohideen about the growing importance of adaptation in finance strategy and the need to address the adaptation finance gap. There's a clear call for public development banks to increase their own financing for adaptation. We heard a bit about EIB's intention to respond to that. Additionally, there's a consensus to bring in more private finance, which is a pretty common refrain of needing to bring in the financial sector, in this case particularly through adaptation concessional finance vehicles, as well as a need to focus on developing economies that are facing the most severe impacts of climate change. So with that, I want to turn to our final two panelists, who are going to provide us with a slightly different perspective. So Mr. Juma, given your experience in climate and biodiversity, what is the role of nature and nature-based solutions in supporting adaptation action on the ground? And can you give some examples of how the Nature Conservancy has worked with public development banks to incorporate nature-based solutions into investment and lending operations?
Thank you very much. I think, first of all, I'll start by introducing the Nature Conservancy, which is a global conservation NGO working with private, public, and indigenous communities to address or tackle climate change, biodiversity crisis, while also uplifting the livelihood of communities with presence in more than 70 countries. So as an organization, we are aiming to support 100 million people who are most vulnerable to the effects of climate change to be better adapted by the year 2030. So coming to your question, the first part of it, so nature-based solution alongside science can reduce vulnerability as well as exposure to the effects of climate change or climate impacts. We're having a lot of projects that I'm going to shortly mention, coastal ecosystem protection and restoration that are reducing storm water discharge, reducing flooding, protection and restoration of forests and wastelands that are helping control soil erosion and the rest. However, it's important to underline that this must be done while streamlining values and principles such as social justice, poverty alleviation, and collaboration with indigenous people and local communities. So talking about the work that the Nature Conservancy has done with the public development banks in mainstreaming or addressing adaptation issues or nature-based solution. One, we've been working with the public, private sector, and as well as public development banks on addressing water security issues. So what we're calling source water protection, where we are conserving, doing conservation measures, be it improve agricultural practices, soil conservation measures at the source. So upstream conservation measures that through the activities that we do will deliver returns for the downstream water users who are paying for upstream conservation. So we started with that in Nairobi, what we are calling Upperton Nairobi Water Fund, which is a successful one. And there is water stress or water need in most of the African countries. So there is a lot of feasibility and viability assessments that are going on in Sierra Leone and in most of West African and East African countries. Just to mention another partnership that we are having amongst many others on this sector is the provision of guarantee and risk insurance for what I'm calling the Nature Conservancy's debt conservation for adaptation, debt swap for debt conservation for adaptation swap. So where we are working with governments on refinancing a portion of their sovereign debts and securing long-term sustainable finance for large-scale protection of marine. For example, during the recent New York Climate Week, the Nature Conservancy announced the Barbados debt swap or marine blue bond, where it was a co-guarantee structure, the Nature Conservancy providing $50 million and IDB providing $100 million. And this freed up $50 million for environmental conservation for 50 years in Barbados, and this they're going to use for mangrove conservation, protection of corals and mangrove along the coastal ecosystem, provision of alternative livelihoods for the coastal communities, amongst others. I'll just stop there for now before providing additional intervention.
Thank you so much. And Ms. Yusum, you are the winner of the AAAP Youth Adapt Challenge. Can you tell us what impact this award has had on your business and how difficult or easy it's been to access finance to support your company?
Thank you very much. My name is Joyce Amarachi Usim. I'm from Nigeria. I'm also the founder of SimK Foods Limited. So what we do in SimK is working with farmers, see how we can improve what they do. So basically, we work with these farmers by teaching them new improved technologies and techniques that will really help them and see how they can improve cultivation. So these are small rural farmers in Nigeria that we work with. And so far, we have a technique which we call the vertical sack farming. So currently, we are working with 22,000 farmers, and it's been a huge progress with those farmers because at the same time, we're increasing their yield, and at the same time, we're increasing their income because they've had so much challenges over the years, and which has posed a very difficult challenge for them. So, and just like I said, the essence of this technique is to see how it usually, so far we've been working with these farmers, it mitigates the effect of climate change with these farmers because it is not rainfall dependent. Yeah, so that's what the technique, which the vertical sack farming does for the farmers. And it's been awesome working with these farmers, and we're really working very hard to expand our farmer base engagement to 100,000 by 2023, and we trust to do that. Yeah, so, and just like I said again, we also look how we can improve their crop productivity, which is very key for us, and we're really, really ensuring that by 2023, this farmers' crop productivity will increase so much that at the end of the day, it will solve food security problem. And at the same time, we were looking out to improve the poverty level of the smallholder farmers in rural Nigerian community. Yeah. So for the other question you asked us, trying to access finance. So for a business like SIMK, it's been pretty difficult because over the years, access to finance has been something we have done on our own. And so far, we've really done our best. But just like I said, it has not been really easy because most organizations see SIMKs, or rather microfinance organizations, usually feel probably we're too qualified. If I have to permit me to use the word, we're too qualified to assess finances. And at the same time, and some other organizations see us as, okay, probably our model is something that they can come in. But thanks to AAAP, which is a program that organizations need to support, they really helped us in technical training aside the financial assistance we've gotten. And as for SIMK, it has even made us ready for investment financing because myself and my team were able to enlarge so much. We got the right trainings, the right investment trainings, and it's been amazing. So I'll give it up to AAAP, GCA, and AFDB. It has been an amazing engagement with them, and we know going forward in the future, we're ready to do so much more to help small rural farmers in Nigeria. Just like I said, we're working very hard to expand where we are to where we want to be, and we trust to do so much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Juma and Ms. Yusum. It's clear from your comments that there's a clear need for financing nature-based solutions in sustainable agriculture, particularly in Africa. And it's also particularly interesting to hear about the financial mechanisms that have or have not worked for you and your organizations. So we have a follow-up question to all the panelists, and we want to delve a bit more into the adaptation needs in Africa. A recent climate policy initiative report estimates that the continent needs $277 billion annually to implement its nationally determined contributions and meet 2030 climate goals. But climate finance in total only reached $29.5 billion in 2021. Harnessing climate investment opportunities in Africa will require innovation in financing structures and strategic deployment of public capital, especially when focusing on adaptation and considering the need to include nature and ecosystem services. What sort of innovative financial mechanisms have you seen for adaptation that work particularly well, or what would you like to see that doesn't exist yet? Dr. Mohideen, we're going to start with you.
Right. Thank you so much. And before I start, I'd like to congratulate Ms. Usim for her innovative solution, and we hope to get that at scale as well. And if there is a platform to benefit as well from her experience, not just with the end results, but how she managed to get the support that would be useful for other initiatives around the continent and beyond. And definitely COP27 will be welcoming such participation. I'm happy with your reference to the climate policy initiative, Ms. Pinko, and actually I have the same report in front of me. So I would say that's as an essential reading, in addition, of course, to the MDBs joint report that was mentioned by Mr. Fayol earlier. The requirements for adaptation, as modest as we are today at 11.4 billion, are required to be enhanced 6 times to reach a minimum of 62 billion. And this is very conservative because they are linked to the NDCs that have been already submitted. And there is a feature of some of the NDCs revised, including more recently by the World Bank, that the emphasis on adaptation needs to be even enhanced. So this is a very conservative figure to the requirements. I'd like to take as well another figure of the requirements in typical African country that you may need up to 4 to 5% of GDP for adaptation requirements. You relate that to the budget of the state. This is typically anything between 20 to 30% of the budget. If the Minister of Finance in office is to answer she or he the demands coming from line ministries responsible for adaptation, that would exhaust 1/3 of the budget. So that is not sustainable. But we need really to do better job in the public-private partnerships. I'm happy that there is this kind of interest in encouraging the private sector to do more in that, but we need to be respective of the comparative advantage rule. There are some areas that the private sector engagement, including in risk management, and I totally adhere to what Ms. Amin just mentioned about the capacity of the private sector to be a better risk manager than the public sector. But at the same time, we know that there are limits of that if the commercial benefit are not fully realized, or the business environment is not supportive, or as she said, that there are many obstacles and hurdles facing the private sector to adequately engage. However, there are many opportunities, and we see that in our pipeline of projects, to which I encourage you to have a look at, because there are lots of public-private partnership examples in the adaptation front, focusing on agriculture, food and water management, and there are some areas related to resilient infrastructure as well, including cities and coastal areas. I would say as well, with this excellent reference to the work of the enhancers through nature conservancy work, including more recently in Barbados, this is a very good model actually, because the beauty of the Barbados model, it's not just linked to a project, which is fine. Like in the case of Seychelles, the case of Belize, these are good examples for debt swap arrangements, linking them to climate or nature. But the good example that came from Barbados that can take us to scale, and linking the whole thing to KPIs, and the KPIs are themselves linked to the NDCs coming from countries. So they are going to be fully owned by the states. They are going to be linked to policy measures, not just to project-specific kind of constraints, but definitely at the end, they are going to be reflected in investments in some particular sector, but can give some better flexibility than being just project-oriented from the very beginning. So that's being encouraged, really, and we'll have many sessions discussing these examples at the blue, green, and the pavilions as well in COP. One more area, and I'll stop at that, in the innovation front, is basically on the carbon credit markets and how they can really be developed further. And I'm happy here, we know that Europe is very advanced, and I appreciate that China got some sort of knowledge and technical assistance from Europe. This could be a good way of the knowledge part and the technical assistance part that the European Investment Bank can be leading. And I'm happy to see some good advances in this work, including from the Financial Regulatory Authority of Egypt, led by Mohammed Farid, the chairman, and in close collaboration in the future with Gabon, which is very advanced in their thinking under the leadership of Minister Lee White. So this is very much a Pan-African kind of a market, trying to capture the knowledge, and with some good guidance as well, it could be fulfilling the capturing of value of these carbon credit markets and adhering to the rules of integrity and safeguards to be attached to them. Being carbon markets, as I say, that doesn't mean that we are going to carbon copy them from more advanced markets unless the experience is of relevance and could be standardized. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Fayol, same question to you.
Well, thank you very much. It's difficult because Mahmoud has already covered a lot. So I'll give you two examples. And I think the difficulty to put in place the good structures to develop adaptation projects is not a lack of willingness to support. It is more in the family of these are projects that often are smaller size, imply technical assistance, imply, if you want to be successful, to be as early as possible involved. And you need to combine a number of stakeholders. The example that I would like to give is an example that Mahmoud knows well, because the World Bank is also a part of the financier. It is called the City Climate Fund Gap Fund, the City Climate Finance Gap Fund. Otherwise, just say the Gap Fund, that's fine. And there are two big multilateral institutions involved, the World Bank and EIB. There are a number of countries that are providing grant assistance, in particular the Germany and Luxembourg. And the German cooperation, it said, is also a big part of the success of it. And what it does is helping cities in designing nature-based solutions and adapt the development of the cities, taking into account episodes of extreme heat or extreme floodings. And here you see, I think, what makes a project successful or not. It needs cooperation, and here you have cooperation between, and it works in many cities in the world, actually, this project, including in Africa. It needs better understanding of what adaptation means. It needs to be active in the early stage in the policy shaping and policy design, and being able to also to learn lessons from what has worked or not in other cases. And of course, it needs to be able to finance at scale, as Mahmoud said. So these are the kind of projects that I think we need to develop and try to scale up, because there is a need to scale up. We also have other projects. I'm not going to be long, so on a project interesting for me is a project called CRAFT. This is climate resilience projects for private companies. But what I would like to say is, we really would like to be engaged with all promoters of projects or all municipalities, because a lot is at stake. It takes time.
Thank you so much. And Ms. Amal, Ms. Amin, the same question back to you. I know you wanted to talk a bit more about the Adaptation and Resilience Collaborative.
Yes, so thank you. So as I mentioned, through the Adaptation Resilience Investors Collaborative, we've been working to try to overcome many of these challenges. I think, just referring back to some of the points made earlier, we really need much more relevant metrics. So we've been working, there's been a work program on what we refer to as investor relevant metrics that are more meaningful to either us as a DFI, but also private and commercial investors as well, which will be really critical that they start to understand this better as they start, increasingly become concerned about climate risk, whether that's transition risk, which has been quite well documented and assessed certainly in many of the European and OECD markets, but much less physical climate risk, which we know is unfortunately so much more acute already in developing and emerging economies. So that's been a big part of it. Another is we've been whilst we have most of the members of the collaborative are DFIs, which focus in the private sector, we also have multilateral development banks, bilateral development banks and agencies who are also working very much with governments to help address some of these barriers upstream. And I think as a collaborative, we can also help better communicate what we think is needed to really unlock more private investment and reduce, and where public investment can best, really mobilize private investment, and the role of PPPs, public-private partnerships, these will be, it's critical that the right kinds of incentives, climate risk, and as well as the incentives to bring forward the resiliency solutions, particularly in infrastructure, that these are really embedded well into PPP frameworks. So, this is part of the work that we're doing. Also, as I mentioned, many of the companies being quite small scale, early stage. We've been partnering also with Climate Kick last year to look at how to help bring forward. Help build out more of the ecosystem, whether that's some incubators to accelerators to later stage growth investment, to address the challenges across the whole spectrum, if you like. And this is something that we think, much more of this will be needed, because we know that because adaptation needs and the specific solutions tend to be very context specific and local in light of the particular vulnerability, which is a function of the climate risk, the physical climate phenomena, as well as location, as well as the specific context or vulnerability of the asset itself or community. We'll need to see lots and lots of services being provided in a local context. So, really, really important that we see more of this, and that, through our collaboration, we can bring that forward. Do also want to highlight that the role of nature-based solutions is going to be very, very critical in delivering resiliency. That, I think, is an area that the Nature Conservancy, and we've been talking with TNC, London, European office about, how we can also collaborate more in that respect, because we absolutely need to bring all our resources, both financial as well as expertise, the human capital alongside the financial capital, as to urgently as possible to this agenda.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chuma, the same question back to you on financial mechanisms that you'd like to see or are working well.
I'll quickly mention too, not to repeat what the other panelists have mentioned. So there is what we're calling the Africa Communities and Climate Tourism Fund that the Nature Conservancy and partners helped launch. And this is mainly to support tour operators who are recovering from COVID pandemic. They access the small and medium tour operators, and they access concessional loans. And in exchange, there are conservation commitments that they make, currently helping preserve or protect 694,000 hectares, almost the size of Texas. This is a model that can be replicated, where they're accessing concessional loan, but also, in exchange, delivering other, conservation commitments. The other one is the Africa Forest Carbon Catalyst that I lead. It's a Nature Conservancy's initiative that is helping incubate quality natural climate solution projects or nature-based projects across the continent. Currently, we are providing technical assistance as well as upfront grants to incubate 20 projects. We're aiming to double those. There are a lot of feasibility constraints. There are a lot of barriers, as have been mentioned. Access to quality germplasm for tree planting projects, access to technical assistance, but that's what we're providing and helping ensure that these projects become investment ready. What we are not seeing quickly, so that I give opportunity to my other colleague, is being bolder in bridging the gap between opportunity and investment. That needs to happen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I certainly have heard a lot today about the opportunity investment and taking bolder risks there. Ms. Yusim, handing it back to you for any final words and what you'd like to see out of financial mechanisms or what's working for you.
Okay, thank you so much. For the few years, one of the financial mechanisms I've really observed closely is the Green Climate Funds, which is headed by the UNFCCC. And I've closely worked and see how they have been able to help adaptation and mitigations practice in developing countries, which will definitely agree that SMSE in Africa really, it's important that we are easily able to adapt to innovations and at the same time carry out good practices that help farming. And also, I really want to see progress in adaptation and mitigation, because the kind of funds that is going to be used to help MSMEs will definitely depend on how much investment that is being put in. Because when those investment is being put in, we can definitely agree that there will be more new innovation practices, and at the same time adopting new technologies that will help MSMEs, and at the same time in different sectors and in different African countries. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you to all our panelists. To give just a quick summary from my end, it seems like there's such a strong need to really increase public finance for adaptation and development, and also to just increase our understanding on what counts as adaptation and the data that's available for that. Several of you mentioned debt for climate or adaptation swaps, which seems to be a vehicle that's gaining a lot of interest lately. And Mr. Foyel and Dr. Amin mentioned some ways that people are really trying to mobilize more private finance and create some collaborative efforts in that area. We've also heard from Ms. Yusuf that the need for micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises in adaptation and the resilience field are particularly in need to greater access of finance, which is something I've not just heard from you, but also from several other participants today. So I want to make sure we drive that point home. And with that, thank you all very much for your time, and thank you to our panelists.
And thank you, Nicole, for this excellent moderation. Ladies and gentlemen, it is now time to make a small break. We will be back in a few minutes for the last panel of the day. Stay with us, please. Restez avec nous, mesdames et messieurs. Dans quelques instants, nous débuterons le dernier panel de cette journée. Merci de rester dans la salle. Welcome back for the last session of the day. Soyez les bienvenus pour ce dernier panel de cette première journée, effectivement, d'événement. Alors, le panel...
This is our first day of the event. The panel will be telling us about reinventing how PDBs invest in resilient healthcare and adaptive social protection. And the panels that have preceded were followed with great interest.
Health of Health and Social Protection at AFD, l'Agence française de développement. Agnès, je vous prie de bien vouloir commencer cette session.
Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to today's panel on reinventing how PDBs invest in resilient healthcare and adaptive social protection. It takes place under the umbrella of the Coalition for Social Investment of Finance in Common, which is co-led by the Agence Française de Développement and the Council of Europe Development Bank. This session is very important while PDBs played a critical role in responding to the COVID-19 important crisis and challenges do remain. First, investments in national and regional public health institutions have been severely neglected before 2020, leading us to having to invent the response to COVID at a critical time. Second, health systems did not benefit from the right level of investments before 2020, particularly in human resources and infrastructure. And even though it represents a dynamic sector of employment and economic growth. Third, most countries still lack strong social protection systems to weather the impact of new large-scale future shocks. Finally, mounting pressures on the multilateral system to deliver ambitious and concrete results require decisive action. To respond to these challenges, public development banks did respond, and they still have a key role to play in the future. They have expertise, knowledge of local markets, and they can bridge financing gaps or scale-ups through co-financing arrangements. To capture these priorities, the session builds on the proposed investment agenda for health and social protection, which aims to strengthen what we all have in common, the health commons, the public health infrastructure, from pandemic preparedness to climate readiness. This agenda, I encourage you to consult it on the web. It's available in the Summits app and in the Finance in Common website. It has 3 pillars. First, investing in public health institutions, such as national public health agencies, medicine agencies, and regulation and accreditation agencies, quality assurance agencies. Second, invest in human resources and infrastructure for health services. And third, foster the growth of a quality healthcare industry. We believe this agenda sends a clear signal that PDBs stand ready to do more, to help to scale up, and develop joint co-financing arrangements with a view to provide efficient and concrete global financing arrangements. Together, we should contribute to more agile pool mechanism at global level. Your feedback on this document, which is up for consultation on the web, would be most welcome, as well as to signal our organization's potential interest and your organization's potential interest to contribute. To discuss these challenges, let me turn to our very distinguished panelists with us today. And let me start with Dr. Ahmed Ogwell Ouma, who is the acting director of Africa CDC and is joining us from Addis. Dr. Ouma, the Africa CDC has emerged as a major institutional force during the COVID-19 pandemic, structuring the network of public health institutions in the Africa continent. You are right now estimating the investment needs for immediately boosting Africa's public health institution capacity, and you estimate it to be about 1 billion. What is your assessment of the public health institutional needs in Africa, including from financial point of view to make sure the continent is better equipped when the next pandemic strikes? What would be the first priority for investments when it comes to strengthening core public health institutions in Africa?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Agnes, and good evening where you are. It is night here. Good morning to those joining from the other side of the Atlantic. It's a pleasure to be here. Let me probably begin this by just sharing some of the lessons that we've learned. One very big lesson is that health is not a service. It's a very serious investment that when we don't invest properly in systems that are effective, then when something as big as a pandemic comes or something as small as an outbreak, then it is going to disrupt our social and economic infrastructure. It's a very big lesson we learned. And from that lesson, we need to move into the future, taking each opportunity to turn the lesson into action that is going to protect us better going into the future. So let me go right to the end and say, what is our priority today? Our priority is to ensure that Africa has systems that can and will be able to detect any outbreak quickly and respond to it effectively and not allow it to spread into the community. This is the biggest priority that we have, but it has many aspects. There are many experts and individual institutions that need to contribute to that particular priority. We must build systems. And systems has three major parts. One are institutions that function. Two are experts, the individuals that are going to contribute to the strengthening of that institution. And three is resources that are required to run those institutions. So these are the three things that we need to bring together in an organized way so that we are better prepared for tomorrow. We cannot afford to do the same things we were doing during SARS, during Ebola in West Africa, during COVID. We can't afford to do the same things. We must do things differently. Which brings me to really where we can be able to work together with the PDBs. You know, when we look at the Africa today, in fact, globally, there are transitions that are happening. There are transitions in disease, there are transitions in demography, there are transitions in development assistance for health, and there are transitions in as far as domestic resource mobilization is concerned. So we need to work together to make sure that all these four transitions come in a place that is going to be good for health security. As Africa CDC, we've done our part. During the pandemic, we have strengthened the capacity of our member states, their institutions, their governance mechanism, training experts, etc. We have led the continent in vaccines acquisition, in diagnostics acquisition, in therapeutics acquisition. But at the same time, we have moved a step further and we have said, let's strengthen our own local manufacturing capacity so that tomorrow we are not procuring from outside, but we are utilizing what is already here on the continent. Therefore, the way I see PDBs, contributing towards resilient health systems, that's what I said was a big priority. You can do it in several ways. One is partner with us as Africa CDC and other institutions of the continent to look at health as an investment. It is urgent because we don't know when the next outbreak is going to be big enough to disrupt the economy. So if we invest in health systems with at the back of our minds, protecting society, protecting the economy, then it becomes a development issue. Secondly is we need to shift from doing business as usual, right? Using the older mechanisms that have not worked very well. We need to move into the space of not just strengthening systems, but ensuring that those systems are sustainable, working with member states for domestic resource mobilization to ensure that those systems are actually sustainable. And finally, it is for you as PDBs to work with us, and I'm talking about Africa here, that our priorities come first. Come to us with the mindset and ask us, what is your priority as Africa? And we will tell you what our priority is, and working together, we'll be able to not only strengthen the systems, we'll do it in a way that ensures that tomorrow, when an outbreak comes, we are not asking people from very far, we are doing it ourselves, and then support can be able to come to help in strengthening our response, not that we have nothing to show and others have to do the helping. So these are, together with PDBs, is extremely, extremely urgent, based on the priorities of this continent. I thank you, Agnes.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Uma. So a very clear message about the need, the lessons learned from the crisis, about the need to invest in institutions, both national and regional, and institutions that will allow also investments in capacity of production of the needed medical products, such as vaccines and medicines, and a clear call for all financing partners to invest in these institutions, and particularly invest in the national and regional CDCs. Let me move to, let me turn to Masoud Ahmed, who is also with us. Masoud Ahmed is the president of the Center for Global Development, and was a chair of the co-chair of the G20 high-level panel on investment in the health commons, particularly prevention and preparedness to pandemics. As part of this high-level panel, you called for a massive multilateral financing instrument for pandemic preparedness. With the World Bank PPR 5th, Pandemic Preparation, Prevention, Preparedness and Response 5th, about to be established, how do you see this new mechanism, this global fund, which is, I think now has received up to 1.5 billion of pledges? How will it be addressing the aid fungibility issue and leveraging truly additional financing for the health commons? Also promoting domestic investments. And what would you see the role of this group here, the Coalition of Public Development Banks, in co-financing projects that are supported by the FIF, aligning and strengthening FIF-funded projects and building them within midterm financing frameworks?
Merci, Agnès. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. And I want to answer the question you've raised. And I want to do that by starting off really to celebrate the fact that we do now have a pandemic prevention preparedness fund that has been established. It's housed at the World Bank, and I'm very glad that Priya Basu is part of the panel, and she will no doubt tell us more about it. And this was indeed one of the recommendations, one of the key recommendations of the panel, the G20 Commission panel that I was a member of, which you referred to. But you gave one number, Agnes, which was the 1.4 billion, I believe is the number, 1.5 billion, which is the money that is currently being received by this fund. Now, just to put it in perspective, what the panel was recommending was 10 billion a year to be spent for pandemic prevention and preparedness. So while we should celebrate, we should not declare victory, because this is a very small fraction of the funding that will be needed to be able to make a sustainable dent into the building the capacity, exactly the point that was being made by the previous speaker, to build the capacity to make sure the next time round we are better prepared. Second thing I would say is we now have this FIF. It's started up. we spent a fair amount of time trying to work out the governance structure, who's going to be on the board and how the board is going to be set up. All that is necessary. But we now need to move to be able to show some quick wins and results. Because if you want to increase the prospects of continued financing for this instrument, then in a year's time, in 2 years' time, we need to be able to show that it has started to make a difference in terms of demonstrating strengthened capacity for surveillance, pandemic surveillance, for other dimensions of pandemic prevention and preparedness. So let's go with the countries and partners where there are already projects that could help to advance this agenda and try to demonstrate early results. And that's the third point I want to make, which is that it's a small amount of money. And the whole design of it was that it would be a catalyst and it would leverage other kinds of funds, both national, domestic resources within the countries that would be better aligned with it, but also by leveraging, by making more concessional the financing that is available from the World Bank, from the other public development banks. And it's very important that we can demonstrate that leveraging concept as well, because otherwise, in an already crowded field with many instruments, what we don't want is that the fifth becomes just one more instrument for financing that works alongside but does not leverage and catalyze. And that's why I personally have been very happy with the fact that it ended up sitting inside the World Bank, which already has a very large program of pandemic prevention and preparedness as part of a broader health systems strengthening agenda. But we must now make a very conscious effort to demonstrate that that leveraging is taking place. And I think with the leveraging, with the early results, not just with the World Bank, but with the other public development banks, we'll be able to show the kinds of outcome that will then generate the virtuous cycle of additional funding, which will help us to get to levels of annual financing, which will make this a sustainable and real impact on pandemic preparedness for the next time around, recognizing that even with a tenfold increase, the amounts we're talking about are a fraction of what the cost will be if we have to endure another pandemic. So let me stop with that and look forward to the inputs and interventions of the other panelists. Thank you, Agnes.
Thank you very much. Masood. I think very, very important messages there. First is, with all the enthusiasm there is about this new pandemic preparedness fund, the fund is only holding 1.4, 1.5 billion, and that is only a fraction of what is needed in terms of investment. And we just have this exercise that Dr. Uma just conducted at Africa CDC, which shows that only for public health institutions in Africa, we're already talking about 1 billion. So there will need to be a coalition of investors, and this is what we are here. A coalition of public development banks, and we all need to think about how together we will mobilize the funding needed. And the second point is really the catalytic role. And I think there is a lot of enthusiasm in public development banks about the new fund because of that. Because it is located at the bank who is familiar with financial instruments that can foster blending, that can foster coalition of investors. And I think there is very much the hope that we will succeed together. Actually, this is not going to be only the success of the World Bank. It will have to be a collective success of all of us that this fund is indeed catalytic. Maybe let me immediately move to a very important member of the coalition of public development banks in the sense that it played an incredible role during the pandemic, which is Afrexim Bank. So let me turn to Mr. Kofi Asumadu Addo, who is a director at Afrexim Bank. Afrexim Bank has been championing the response to COVID in Africa, designing an incredibly inspiring and powerful mechanism called AVAT, together with the Africa CDC, with a very forward-looking financing framework for vaccines in the countries of the Africa Union. Mr. Asumadu, how do you see the potential of PDBs for scaling up investments in public health infrastructure the way you did during the crisis, and foster collaboration on joint concrete health and social protection projects between regional banks, Public National Bank, and of course, together with the World Bank FIF?
Well, thank you very much for inviting us to share our experiences on what we did during the COVID pandemic period. Those of you who don't know the AVAT, Afrexim Bank worked closely with African CDC and African Union to respond to the COVID by looking at the continent-wide solution that will address the needs of the countries in Africa. And I must say, we even extended this solution to the Caribbean countries as well. So it was for Africa and for the Caribbean countries. What exactly did we do? Afrexim Bank leading the structuring, there was an entity that was set up to lead the procurement, so it became a continent-wide procurement. And we went ahead based on the aggregate of the requirements, placed the order on behalf of the continent. You cannot just place the order because at that time, everybody is chasing for the vaccine. And each and every one was on his own, and God was for us all. So Afrexim Bank, through the AVAT, then went in and issued a guarantee to the vaccine manufacturers, specifically to Johnson & Johnson, on behalf of the whole continent and that of the Caribbean countries. The good news is that once we went in to set up this structure and we decided to put in that guarantee in the issue of collaboration that you are mentioning came in. I must mention that World Bank came in. I must mention that MasterCard Foundation also came in to provide significant support. Other development finance institutions, I must mention AFD, Nexi from Japan, KFW, all came in. What World Bank decided to do is that the obligations of each of the countries where they have an issue and they are unable to fund, they seek approval and then they take over the guarantee obligation from the bank. Through this, the continent was able to be certain that they were also going to get the vaccine that their citizens require. And it has been one of the powerful collaborative instruments and the measures that we have put in place to address this. And we expect that going forward, these kind of issues will be necessary. I'm mentioning that the collaboration has been powerful and it's important because if you are to respond to the health needs, it is not a one institution issue. It requires collective action. And I'm happy to learn what is being done at the World Bank level where the Global Response Facility is being put in place. The continent still needs health solutions. As the CDC mentioned, Systems and structures, strengthening them are key, but it requires resources. When you look at the paucity of the health infrastructure on the continent when the crisis hit, that is where you realize that development finance institutions, we have a lot of work to do. The countries need the facilities. How do you do it? For Afreximbank, we have taken further steps. In addition to supporting the public health infrastructure needs, helping member countries to also get the necessary health facilities and the rest, we are also looking at building centers of excellence across the member countries. We are leading the sponsorship, but we have received huge support from private sector coming in to help us to build these centers of excellence. When we are looking at not only helping the continent to have the quality health infrastructure, but also help the continent where there's the need for health instead of traveling abroad for certain health services. These kind of centers of excellence will be able to respond. The bank is working with King's College London to do these centers of excellence. I think 2 weeks ago, we cut the sword in Abuja, Nigeria, to open the first centers of excellence. As I mentioned, when we appeal to various institutions, the private sector, the kind of response that are coming is key, which means that if we put the right systems, right structures in place, we will get the required support to get it done. Development finance institutions, we already have structures there. What I think we need is partnership. Working in silos, in my view, is not the way forward. We need to collaborate. We need to work. We need to, sometimes when it comes to issues of health, the bureaucracies, we need to bring some element of flexibility in the way we respond to things. And I believe if we are able to do that, the sky will be our limit. Issues of concern that we've been always talking about, we will be able to address it. I will end here if there's any I can add. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think very, very inspiring how during the pandemic, new actors such as Afreximbank have really stepped up to the plate and now are really opening fields for further investments. And I also note your call for coalitions and collaboration. We will only be able to address that investment agenda together. Let me turn to Dr. Anand Morsi from the UN ECA, and you've also played a very important role in that response to COVID and the coalition of institutional actors around the Africa Union. You've been long calling for more cooperation between international donors on the issue of health and extended to social protection in health. What are the key needs you identify now to enhance the leveraging power of public development banks in this agenda?
Thank you. A pleasure to be with all of you, and very much enjoyed the discussion and the insights of colleagues on the panel. The needs in Africa, especially on the health side, are huge. Africa bears 24% of the world disease burden, and diseases that are actually treatable like HIV, tuberculosis, malaria constitute great percentage of this. There is a lot that can be done to actually help in that side. And also, given the composition and demographics of the continent, this is a young and getting even younger and growing fast. The health needs and health spending will be also growing fast. At the same time, we have seen that health spending have not grown, average about 5% of GDP, and have not really been growing much over the last 2 decades. So there are huge needs. I think we have seen also, as you mentioned earlier, the role of the public development banks evolving with the pandemic. So even though before the pandemic, these entities used to focus more on small, medium enterprises, agriculture, housing, we've seen the agility of them coming to help within the pandemic. And I think this is perhaps an element that we need to pay attention to in terms of the ability of these institutions to evolve also and support the recovery going forward. So it will need, their support will need to move from the focus of the procurement, for example, of medical supplies, to actually the development and supporting the development of a resilient supply chain of medical products and pharmaceutical. So I think there can be a very important role going forward of the public development banks, particularly in terms of innovative financing mechanisms, and in addition to that, issues of equity, providing guarantees, technical assistance, credit enhancing instruments. This will be very critical. Providing long-term capital will be key, and also the issue of becoming a catalyst that we've been talking about. I think that's the most important issue here going forward. It's not just even the best that they can do. The resources they can bring are limited. What really brings the scale is their ability to act as a catalyst to attract other financing and investment. So that will be key going forward, and that can be, enhanced through pooled investment vehicles, guarantees, using things like first loss guarantees, considering development impact bonds, and really focusing also on this issue of the health supply chain and the pharmaceutical manufacturing. I think the continent has a huge potential in these areas, and we need to really kind of use the momentum and all what we have gone through over the last few years as an impetus of really moving forcefully in that direction. In addition, there are also issues about, in general, I think the need to move from just humanitarian approach that, relies on grants to a more sustainable and scalable. And that's really in the direction of what we were discussing earlier, because that would be, we need a model and a system that can be sustained going forward, and is not just based on the concessionary elements, but based on attracting investments and offering products that can actually enhance the crowding in of private sector. And another area I think also that would be very useful for public development banks to pay more attention to going forward is the issue of logistics infrastructure of and distribution of pharmaceutical within the continent, in addition to what we discussed. Perhaps just as an illustration to just put in context the potential for a population of 1.3 billion in Africa. We currently have 375 drug manufacturers, and for similar population in China and India. In China you have 5,000, and in India you have 10,500. So you can see that, you know, in proportion, we have a long way to go. And a lot can be done in that area. I think the good perhaps also issue to mention is the potential that the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement brings, and how we can leverage that not only to develop within countries but across the regions. And I see that you came to the screen, so I'll turn back to you. Thank you.
Very much. Thank you, Dr. Morsi. As the chief economist of ECA, you really hit the nail in highlighting the chronic underinvestments in health in the Africa region, particularly public investments, which has actually declined as a share of public expenditures over the past years. And you outline a very rich and ambitious agenda. There is a lot to do to develop the domestic health industry and institution and the institution building agenda. Let me move quickly to Priya Basu at the World Bank. Mrs. Basu, the fifth is generating a lot of hope that it will help address the system weaknesses. You heard it from here. We are all talking about the fifth. And there is a lot of hope that it will scale up impact for beneficiary countries. How will the World Bank work with other IFIs to leverage the firepower of public development banks and foster co-financing of projects? How can PDBs best contribute in your view? How can we join you? And can the FIX members help FIF become a massive financial instrument for global health, which we all are wishing for?
Well, thank you, Agnes, and thank you for the invitation to join you today. As my previous co-panelists mentioned, COVID really showed us how ill-prepared the world was to face a pandemic and the massive investment needs. I should point out, though, that Africa was really a shining example. The Africa CDC, AVAT, Afri-Exim Bank really stepped up and I think showed us, gave us some very important lessons on how regions can play, regional institutions can play a really important role, and we were thrilled to be able to support that and to work with AVAT and with Afri-Exim Bank and with the Africa CDC. As the other co-panelists have mentioned, investing now in pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response really can not only save lives, but also save financial resources for the years to come. And I think COVID really has highlighted that, and it's made the investment case for us of the importance of investing now in PPR, as Dr. Uma highlighted in his remarks. And the high-level independent panel that was co-chaired and supported by CDG and by Dr. Masood Ahmed really made that case for a new dedicated financial intermediary fund at the World Bank to support PPR. So we're thrilled that we've now established the fifth. It was formally launched and established on September the 8th. The governing board of the fifth met for the first time on September 8th and 9th. It's in fact had 2 meetings now. A very engaged group. We spent a lot of time designing the governance and kind of overall arrangements, and now we are ready to move to the next phase, which is operationalizing the fifth. I'm really honored to be the executive head of the secretariat of this new fifth hosted by the World Bank. The objective of this fifth is to finance critical investments for strengthening PPR capacities at country, regional, and global levels, with a focus on low and middle income countries. It's been pointed out that the needs are enormous, and what we have right now is $1.4 billion. But I'm happy to say that we have more investors that are willing to and have expressed interest to join the partnership. So we're looking forward to growing the fund. But as of now, it's a partnership of 22 donors that include 19 sovereign donors and 3 philanthropies. Plus, of course, the sovereign co-investors, as we call them, which is the countries that could potentially benefit from the fifth, civil society organizations, the World Bank, a group of other MDBs, the WHO, UNICEF, FAO, global health institutions like the Global Fund, Gavi, CEPI, are all partners. And we're looking forward to this so-called collective. It really is a partnership. Let me focus on kind of 3 key elements, which I hope will address the question you raised, Agnes. So 3 key principles guiding this fifth are coordination, complementarity with existing institutions, and catalyzing additional resources. So I call them the 3 C's of the fifth. In terms of coordination, this fifth seeks, it's not a new institution. It's not going to crowd the already crowded global health architecture, but rather it's going to promote coordination across existing actors at the global, regional, and national levels. It's going to complement the financing of existing institutions. So every dollar of grant financing that the fifth will provide will actually be channeled through what we are calling implementing entities, but they're really the financial intermediary, the channels for financing, and those are MDBs, UN agencies, and other global health institutions. And we will be growing this group of intermediaries. And then the aspiration is that every dollar of grant financing that the fifth provides will actually catalyze additional financing. It will catalyze this financing through the co-financing that our implementing entities will bring at the project level. And it will also seek to catalyze financing from other sources at the project level, and those could be, bilateral agencies. Those could be other players that are engaged at the country level and at the regional level. And every dollar of grant financing seeks to also incentivize countries themselves to invest, hopefully, in this agenda. This is a long-term agenda. It's an intergenerational agenda. So through the blending of grants with the loans that MDBs and other agencies provide, we hope that this will be an incentive for countries to take on more financing for PPR, and also kind of bring in their own commitments. Hopefully, even though 1.5 billion is a small amount given the larger needs, we should look at this amount in terms of the grant financing that will catalyze much more financing from various actors at the project level. In terms of the aspirations, kind of in terms of the scope, first and foremost is strengthening country level capacity, enhancing PPR capacity and capabilities at the country level through strengthening national health institutions and strengthening kind of capacity for disease surveillance, lab systems, national health workforce capacity, community engagement, emergency communication and management, then also building capacity at the regional levels. In some of these areas, aggregating surveillance, reporting, information sharing from country to regional and then global. Regulatory harmonization, and also building capacity for coordinated development, procurement, and deployment of critical medical countermeasures, as was mentioned, vaccines, therapeutics, diagnostics, and essential medical supplies, so that the world does not face the kind of inequities that we faced during COVID. So the scope is very much to prevent, prepare, and contain, to build capacity to prevent, prepare, and contain, so that then when the pandemic does hit, hopefully, these countries are much better prepared, and so the cost of response becomes lower, and that response can be done in an effective manner. As I speak, we're now working to identify what the priorities will be for the first call for proposals, which we hope to announce by the end of this calendar year, or at the very latest by early in the next calendar year. This will be the call for proposals from countries and partner organizations seeking funding from the fifth. And then we hope to be able to allocate the first round of funding by the middle of next year. So stay tuned, and we're very much looking forward to working with this coalition, with NDBs, with PDBs, the first call will outline the kinds of criteria that are required, but be rest assured that kind of the areas that you are focused on, which is co-financing, catalyzing, blending. These will be first and foremost in the design of the call. So thank you very much again, and I hope I was able to answer some of your questions.
Thank you very much, Priya Basu from the World Bank, and a lot of information about the fifth and what we together can do for this to be a success in terms of all together building a coalition of investments in public health infrastructure. We still have two people we really want to hear from, and let me turn to Rodrigo Salvado, who represents the Asian Investment Bank. And my question to you as Director General of AIB is that how do you see the collaboration between multilateral development banks and PDBs in this area? And the impact these players can have, particularly in addressing the health infrastructure gap that you are known for.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Agnes, and thank you to all the brave ones in the room at this point, right? So, thank you very much for staying late. So I will keep it quick, and again, it's a great panel. I will say, for me, at the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, it's actually great to see the eagerness of the bank to get into health, right? I think that, it's a global challenge, and the more the merrier, right? At the same time, again, the bank has been initially very focused on physical infrastructure, but understood that there is no way you're going to continue financing physical infrastructure if you don't actually focus on social infrastructure, right? Because if you don't focus on social infrastructure, there's no going to be infrastructure that you're going to be able to finance. So this is actually demand-driven, it's client demand. But at the same time, what we don't want to do is to play bumblebee soccer, right? So you throw the ball and everyone goes there and everyone. I think that the best that we can do as a bank is actually focusing on what we know. So we are not going to try to become, the World Health Organization, the Global Fund or anything. What we have is a scale and capital, right? And what we can do is actually that. So I think that, my way of looking at these things is actually coordination. I think Priya was saying, right? Like, you have to complement and coordinate and complement. So we know what we can bring, right? So we don't want to imitate others. And I see in health, my previous life was at the Gates Foundation doing health, and also at the African Development Bank. But I see that a lot of institutions trying to do everything, and you cannot do everything. I think that we need to be much more as a system, right, as an ecosystem working on this. One specific thing that I think that the PDBs can do for us, right, and I think for everyone, is they are closer to the issues. They are closer there, right? We have a bank, we don't have a country office in every area. We don't want them, right? But what we want is actually the pipeline. So to me, the PPPs is about pipeline. So if we can have, the national development banks helping us to source that in coordination, right, and collaboration with the health institutions, for us is what we want to do. So in my mind, the message is, the sources of capital, we can bring that and unlock that. I was saying catalytic, right? But again, we all need to play our part. And hopefully, right, again, the FIB is a great example. What we don't want is actually now $1.4 billion divided into 50 parts, right? So hopefully we can get our act together, and when that call of proposal actually, is done, is saying we are going to focus on a few places where we can actually work together. Because otherwise it's going to be a hunger game, right? And nothing is going to actually, not like even $10 billion, as Masoud was saying, will actually be, enough.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And I really kept you the next speaker for the end, because I think he's the one who's going to bring the conclusion. So let me give the floor for the last intervention. This is going to be our concluding intervention to Dr. Jitinji Jihahi, who is the Group Chief Executive Officer of AmRes Health Africa. And Jitinji is somebody who has worked all his life as a not-for-profit health sector leader in Africa with this great organization that AmRef is, with both a service provider in many countries of Africa as well as an advocate. And you've been very active in actually advocating for more investments in the health sector. So we would very much like your views, having witnessed the crisis, the pandemic, having witnessed the response and the actors. What do you think should be our next steps?
Thank you very much. And I'm really used to being in meetings where we are just health policy makers, but now I'm in the midst of bankers. So I feel like I'm addressing a different issue here, the same issue but differently. And I think therefore, as I listen to prayer, I have changed my conversation to actually challenge prayer and challenge the thief on thinking of how we should do things differently. And I hope prayer can still hear me. So what I would like to propose to the thief is to rethink the implementation framework, which the FIF has picked up to do it through UN agencies and all these kinds of things. That is the beaten path. And I'm thinking that probably the FIF should reorient itself and implement through the PDBs, and I'll explain why. And really the underlining word here is catalytic, that actually the FIF should be catalytic, should not follow the beaten path. I'm glad, Priya, you're still here. So I hope by the end of my submission I can convince you where I mean this, that we should follow, the money should follow these guys. Now, the first thing I want to do is just mention about health services in Africa, and I think my senior, Dr. Ahmed Ogwell, who is leading Africa CDC, talked a bit about this. Health access in Africa is still under 40%, and some of us think it's actually much lower than that. You know, that is availability. When you add demand, we've seen what happened with the vaccines. We're somewhere around, not even 20%. So we would say that health services are very, very low. Second is, how are these funded? They're financed on a model, of course, doesn't apply to every country, but you'd say 30, 30, 30. If you just looked at where we are now, Cote d'Ivoire, $75, about $25 is from the government, another maybe a similar amount is from donors, and the other amount is from out of pocket. So we are talking about $75. Even if you increase that, I can tell you, public financing, because of the low fiscal space, the government funding will not go very far. On average, $50, $60. So we have a problem with the fiscal space. We don't have adequate money. So where does the 30, 30, 30 go? The government money, the 30% goes to pay health workers. So the health workers are paid by government. Most of the money, 70% of that will pay health workers. A little amount remaining will pay health technologies and products. Then out of the public, out of pocket, it will largely go to health products and commodities for chronic care. Because there is no funding there. There's no funding for hypertension, diabetes, and cancer. And the other 30% of donors is actually going to commodities for infectious diseases. That's where the money is going. Now, without taking too much time, I want to just reflect that if you are just to put Gavi, the Global Vaccine Alliance, and the Global Fund together, the total expenditure in the last 20 years is over $60 billion. In the last 20 years, for just those two institutions. $60 billion. What did I say? Most of that money goes to commodities, because that's what these institutions are able to count. It goes to buying vaccines, buying mosquito nets, buying rapid diagnostic kits for malaria, and the other things. Most of this, I would say 99%, and we saw this during COVID, that most of this is actually imported into the continent. The continent itself has not built capacity to manufacture these. It has capacity, but the multilateral funders have not found a mechanism to purchase from the countries. So the vaccines, 99% of them are imported, the mosquito nets are imported, the RDTs are imported. The question I'm raising here, and this is a question that's really critical to how the PDBs can come in, is, imagine if part of this $60 billion, which majority of it is products and technologies, was actually sourced from Africa. What role would it have played to build institutions like Africa CDC, manufacturing capacity, and actually we would not be where we are now, because 20 years ago, if we had actually sourced from the continent, malaria, mosquito nets, so we would have had enough capacity to build, to actually develop our own PPEs. When COVID came, we had no PPEs. We had to go to the country. Develop diagnostic kits. We had to wait. Africa CDC did a lot of work importing, diagnostic kits from outside. Vaccines. The case I'm making is that we can actually create a tripartite partnership where the domestic resources build regulation, the PDBs build manufacturing capacity, and the grants that are coming to purchase provide a market. This is really the partnership we need to build. And this is why I'm saying, if the catalytic fee fund can go through the PDBs, then they come in and say, we are going to catalyze and bring in, mobilize domestic resources from government and private sector to ensure we build institutions and to ensure we build manufacturing capacity through better regulation. We don't have to wait for WHO to actually approve our commodities. We can create our own stringent regulatory authorities, and I see Ahmed nodding. Then the PDBs bring their donor money, their debt through concessional debt, and then we create a market through grants by forcing Gavi and Global Fund to purchase from Africa. We can actually solve this problem and not have to wait another 20 years to have another crisis that we cannot cater for. That's my proposal. Priya, think about FIF going through the PDBs. Think about putting Global Fund and Gavi on the table and we are going to catalyze the market, but we must make sure you purchase from those markets, and then the PDBs bring in the money to enable private sector to do the manufacturing. I think it's a winning formula.
Thank you, Gigi. That's a powerful way forward. And I think this is going to be the conclusion of this, that we are all going to continue. I mean, Gigi is offering Priya to continue this conversation. I think at the board of the FIF, if I understand well. And we will all, thank you, all of you, for joining this conversation. It's been quite amazing. I think we will use this conversation to move forward in this debate and continue to build this coalition. We are together. We're going to make this fund to be catalytic, and we are going to be sure that we invest in country institutions and country capacity. Thank you very much. Thank you to all of you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Et merci à vous également, Agnès, pour ce panel que vous avez qualifié d'amazing. Et moi, je dirais que non seulement il a été amazing, mais cette journée...
Not only was this day a great day, it is the first day of the summit that is taking place in Abidjan, the capital of Côte d'Ivoire. We thank you very much. And we thank those who were following this discussion in the room and by distance. And we thank you for your interest and your passion. So we'll see you tomorrow at 8:30. And tomorrow the theme will be two sides of the same coin. Thank you again and see you tomorrow.